Good morning. We'd like to welcome you to another edition of the Sunday School Review. This week's Sunday School lesson is entitled Love Fulfills the Law, and it's taken from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 8 through 13, and Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. Now, there are three outlines in today's lesson. The first outline is love never fails, and that's Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 13 chapter verses 8 through 10. And the second outline is love is eternal, and that is 1 Corinthians 13 verse 11 through 13. And the third outline, we go to Romans, and it's the 13th chapter of Romans, verses 8 through 10. Now, in our lesson, Paul is dealing with two letters. The first letter that he wrote to the Corinthians, that is the 13th chapter of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. And the second letter, Paul wrote to Rome, and that is the 13th chapter of Romans, verses 8 through 10. Now, in the letter that he addressed to Corinthians, he were talking about the issue or the problems that they was experiencing was a divisions, and they were concerning spiritual gifts. And because of that, there was envy and jealousy had arose because of the fact of the spiritual gifts, or namely, they was misusing the spiritual gifts, and that's what caused the envy and the jealousy. Now, in the first outline here, well, actually the first and second outline that is in Corinthians, from the 8th verse to the 13th verse of the 13th chapter, Paul is explaining to them. Now, in the 12th chapter, he talked about spiritual gifts. Okay, the spiritual gifts, but and this chapter here, in verses 8 through 13, he's going to explain what spiritual gifts are and what they are not. Is going to be talking about what they are and what they are not. And in this first and second outline, Paul is letting them know. I mean, the summary of our lesson is pretty much simple, okay? And that is, spiritual gifts is meaningless without a demonstration of love. And Paul is going to explain, and once we explain this, it's going to come clear to you. Okay, I see why that the spiritual gifts are meaningless without a demonstration of love. So the spiritual gifts must be motivated by love. Now, love, this love we're talking about here. Now, I know it in the King James Version, it generally says charity, and I will be using love. Love is charity. And this is the agape love that we're talking about. There are different types of love that's discussed in the scripture, but the highest form of love is the agape love. And this is what we're talking about in the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, the agape love, the love of God. Okay, that is the unconditional love. Is not motivated by what you can do for me or reciprocity. Well, you do this for me, I will do that for you. It is not motivated based on how people treat you. And we're going to talk about, the last outline is going to talk about the debt that we owe, and that is the debt of love. Regardless of how people treat you, that is a debt. That is an obligation that cannot be liquidated, cannot be discharged. That is an obligation that we have to love everyone, especially Christians. But we have an obligation. That is a debt that cannot be discharged or cannot be liquidated. That is the debt of love. Okay, so we're talking about love. That is agape love, the love of God. And agape love is demonstrated by action. And God demonstrated that, to give you an example, God demonstrated that by sacrificing his only son for the sins of humanity. Okay, that is an act of love, agape love. Okay, it wasn't based on what mankind could do for him, because we couldn't do anything for him. But God demonstrated his love toward the human race by sending his son. That's agape love, the love of God, which is the highest form of love. And it was motivated by love, for God so loved the world. So love, that is agape love, is motivated by love. Whatever you do, it has to be motivated by love. Okay, so let's read the verses here. It starts at verse 8, and it says, love never fails. Okay, so let's stop here. Love never fails. In other words, love, God's love will never end. That's the first point. Love never fails, or love will never end. That's the first part. Okay, now let's go to the spiritual gifts. So that was the argument about the spiritual gift. That was the reason for the envy, the jealousy, because they were being puffed up. And the lesson, some of the scriptures is not in our lesson. Verse 4, for example, love suffers long, it is kind. Envy is not. So love doesn't envy. Okay, they were envious because some had these special gifts, the gifts of prophecy, tongues, knowledge. All of those are spiritual gifts. So we established the first thing in verse 8, love never fails. Love will never end. Let's go on. After the semicolon, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. So, okay, let's read the rest of it. Or done away. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. They're going to end. There be knowledge, it shall vanish away. So spiritual gifts are temporary, whereas love is permanent, will never end. God's love will never end. So spiritual gifts is temporary. Now, what's the purpose of spiritual gifts? Now, spiritual gifts are present with us today, and the reason that we have is for the perfecting of the church, for the edification of the body. They have a purpose, but their purpose will one day run its course. It's just like we talked last week, where the Pharisees were hung on the law. They failed to realize that the Mosaic law, once Christ came, had ran its course. That's why they were telling the Gentile converts that you must obey elements of the law. No, and that's what Paul was saying. No, the law was to bring us to Christ. That was the purpose of the law. The law had a purpose, absolutely. But once Christ came, the law had ran its course. The Mosaic law had ran its course. So what we're reading here is that one day spiritual gifts will run its course. 8 clearly says, whether there be prophecies, they're going to fail. They're going to be done away. Tongues, done away, will cease. Knowledge, vanish away. So it's only temporary. If something goes away, that tells you it was not permanent. God's love is permanent. It's going to always be here. Okay. So we see that spiritual gifts are temporary. They have a purpose, true, and the purpose is for the perfecting of the saints, the edification. Now okay. So I quite understand. Let's go read verse 9. Well, 9 and 10. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. We don't know everything now, but one day we will. As verse 10 is going to tell us. But when that is perfect is come, when that is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. We will not need it, just like the Mosaic law. The spiritual gifts, when that time comes, we haven't reached that yet, but when that time's come, it says that which is in part shall be done away with. We no longer gonna need it. It will have ran its course. Now, okay, that is that first outline, love never fails, from verse 8 to 10 of this 13th chapter. Now, the second outline is from 11 to 13, and that is love is eternal. And that says all right there. Love is eternal, permanent. Spiritual gifts are not eternal. They will be done away with, but they do have a purpose, and it's for the perfecting of the saints, for the edifying of the body. That's the purpose. But the purpose will end, and when it's, at verse 10 says, when that is perfect is come. When Christ came, the law, and fulfilled the law had ran its course. Now, we on second outline, law is eternal, starting at verse 11. And Paul is saying, when I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. Let's read the entire. For now we see through a glass darkly. So in other words, we don't know everything. We don't know. We don't know all things. You see through a glass dim, but then face to face, now that I know in part, but then when I know, even also as I'm known, I am known. So basically, when we meet the Lord face to face, when we see him in his completeness, okay, that is when we see him face to face, that which was unknown will be revealed, will be known. So one day we will have all the answers, but right now we don't have all the answers. Simply put, we don't have all the answers. But one day when we see him face to face, when we meet him in his completely, we will have all the answers, okay? So that's what verses 10, 11 through 13 is telling us. Okay, when we meet him face to face in his completeness, we will know. But now we don't have all the answers. Okay, now verse 13, which is the last verse in this second outline. Now, three things is going to remain. Three things going to remain according to verse 13. And now abideth faith, hope, hope for the future, and love. These three, of those three, the greatest of these is love. God is love. So we know love is not going to be done away with, because that is an attribute of God. Okay, love is an attribute of God. God is love. So love will never be done away with. Love will never end, but the spiritual gifts will. So Paul is telling us there is no need to get puffed up. They were puffed up, like verse 4 says, it does not vaunt itself, I mean, they were being puffed up. They were being envy of others because some had spiritual gifts. And Paul was saying it. Without love, the spiritual gifts are meaningless. You can have, even if it was possible for you to have manifest all of the spiritual gifts and don't have love, it's all meaningless. It's all meaningless. Without love, nothing else matters. Nothing else matters without the love of God. So love trumps everything else. Love trumps tongues. Love trumps prophecy. Love trumps knowledge. Love trumps everything else. Without the love of God, nothing else matters. And that's really the lesson in summary. Without love, nothing else matters, because love is permanent. Okay, love is an attribute of God. God is love. That was the first two outlines. Love never fails. Love never ends. And love is eternal, because God is love and God is eternal. The last outline, which is our third outline, it's taken from the 13th chapter of Romans, verses 8 through 10 of the 13th chapter of Romans. The Romans 13th chapter, verses 8 through 10. And the subject of that outline is love, the debt we owe. That basically Paul is described. That is the only debt we owe. And that is a debt that cannot be liquidated, cannot be discharged. We owe that debt of love. Okay, verse 8. And before that, we're not going to talk about, but before verse 8, Paul was talking about, if you owe anybody anything, if you owe taxes, pay them. If you owe, whatever you owe, if it's honor, give it. Whatever you owe, give it. Okay, pay it. Okay. Now he's talking about in 8, verse 8 of the 13th chapter. Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another has fulfilled the law. Now, that is has fulfilled the law. Verse 9, which is our key verse. Verse 9. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay, listen. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet. And if by any other commandment, if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Okay, so this is as we call it, the royal law. Love is the royal law. It's a command. It's an obligation that we owe to everyone. We owe regardless to how they treat us, we owe them love. That's an obligation that we have, and that obligation cannot be discharged. It cannot be extinguished. Okay, love is the royal law. Okay, so basically, for the Pharisees, if you want to bring them in, for the Pharisees, if you do these things here, what it says in verse 9, don't commit adultery, do not kill, thou shalt not steal, don't bear false witness, do not covet, and if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended, saying, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, which is the royal law. And again, as I said, that is the commandment, obligation that we have, that is the debt. Let's put it that way. That is the debt that we owe to everyone. And the love is, as I said earlier, unconditional. It's not based on how someone treats you. that you owe them this love. It is irregardless of how someone treats you, you still owe that love. Because love, again, is a virtue of God. God is love. If we, I think the scripture tells us too, if we don't have the love, we not even belong to him. And that's how people know that we are his disciples. That's what scripture tells us. How do people know we are disciples? Because we have love for the brethren. That's how they know. Well, they did you wrong. You still owe them love. You still obligated to love them. Love is a virtue, and we obligated to love everyone, regardless of how they treat us, because God is love, and love is the only debt that we owe, and we owe that to everyone. Especially as Christians, we owe that to everyone, that to love. And if we, as verse 9 tells us, if we do these things, we have fulfilled, verse 8 tells us that also, for he that loveth another has fulfilled the law. Okay, forget about the circumcision and all these other things. If you want to be circumcised, I guess it's okay, but that's not an obligation. The command is to love. Once, if you love, like it says in verse 9, love thy neighbor as thyself, you have fulfilled the royal law. And that's our lesson today. Love fulfills the law. If you have the love of God, that is the agape love, that unconditional love, you have fulfilled the law. And that's our lesson today. We'd like to thank you for watching. We ask you to join us next week for another edition of the Sunday School Review. Thank you.